Welcome, everybody. Thank you very, very much for joining us on this monthly seminar that we have organized from the beginning of the year. The seminar has been dedicated to looking specifically at the history of Islamic ethical traditions and its impact on religion in particular, and its impact on Islam. One of our initial inspiration for this particular project was to actually think whether, the past frameworks, whether they are in Islamic law or theology or philosophy, have an impact, or how do people still think about those frameworks? Do people still think about ethical traditions in relation to that, in relation to how they live, or combining their past ideas, or at least the ideas that are inherited from the past and those that they are confronted with in modern times. But we are in general interested in how, on the other side, about how the Islamic intellectual traditions are confronted by contemporary societies as well. So we're interested in how they impact on Muslim societies or societies in general, and in reverse, how the others do this as well. And so as a result of that, I've been talking to Professor Mal, who is our speaker this week. I've been having a long conversation with him over the years about science and the relationship between science and Islam, the relationship between science and religion. So I have great pleasure in inviting him here. But before I say that, let me at least present to you one or two at least comments about the relationship between science and social theory. What do we work with? What has struck me over the last couple of years is that when you look at the major theories that were developed in the social sciences, particularly in the 19th century, they were always developed first as an attempt to say how different science is from religious traditions. So some of the very earliest theories was to say that this was that religions represent kind of a primitive science, or not scientific enough. And even when they then changed their position, and then they said, well, maybe we should start looking at religious discourses or religious narratives or mythology as having a social function, or perhaps a psychological, or maybe even a political function, it was still kept in balance against a kind of a scientific worldview or a scientific project as such. There's this kind of, so on the one hand, this distinction that was drawn between science and cultural or religious traditions. And then even when the theoretical developments continued to take place and improved on what was done in the 19th century, the specter of science still stands in the background. So even if you look at a great scholar that I admire, that I have worked with a lot, Wittgenstein, his whole idea of language game has emerged out of a desire on his part to formulate a language that would be a language for philosophy, in his case, that would be valid for everybody, for all sciences, for all disciplines. And then he settled on the idea of language games. Different language games would work for different human activities or human functions. I know I'm oversimplifying Wittgenstein, but at least that theory of his, that idea of his, that you have to separate your religious language from everyday language, or everyday language from scientific language, sort of keeps these disciplines, or keeps these ideas in separate spheres as such. And yet we know that as science, or as the scientific developments continue to develop, they do have an impact on, whether social life, they do have an impact on religious life as such. So I thought that this is the one reason why I invited 2 weeks ago Ibrahim Musa, who has been thinking about this topic from Islamic studies, from the study of Islam and the Islamic discipline. We are really happy to have Anwar Mal here, Professor Mal, to give us something, on some insight on the same question, but now from a scientist, from somebody who has been working in science for a long time, but who has also been thinking about these questions. I think the second reason, I know that if I could just add that second sort of background that I want to put this into is that science, or at least the understanding of nature, has over history played a very, very important role important role in thinking about ethics. One of the best ways for me that I can put this forward is what some people in the 1970s called ethical naturalism. So people who live in for example, a desert or near a swamp or a river or a mountain develop a lot of ethical values and ethical practices in relation to their environment. And what is interesting, I think, is that with the development of maybe Enlightenment thinking, with the development of, particularly, I think, development of science, one sees a kind of a separation between ethics and first of all, science. Maybe I should put that in a question mark. Do ethics and science separate? Does science that actually has it got any kind of, have scientific theories have ethical considerations as part of the practice? And do we, and like some ethical theorists say, that modern ethical theories are not so much built on scientific practices, but on rational principles, on rational values, and also, or alternatively, on some kind of pragmatic application of reason as such. So I think this kind of separation, or maybe the tension between ethical theories of the past and modern scientific theories or modern scientific life as such, is also a question that I want to put up there, because this is our project on ethics and religious traditions. We like to think about that as one of the major questions. How do you actually derive, and can we derive, ethical ideas, ethical theories from doing science as such? We know the problems that we are facing with climatic change, the major problems that we are facing with the globe, with what we have done to the world in the last 200 or 300 years, through technology and through the application of science, does raise questions about thinking about ethics as such. Can these ethics come from science? Can the ethics come from a different way of doing science? Or can we begin to think about earlier traditions, religious traditions, where there was a convergence between ethics and a natural, or closer relationship between ethics and the natural world? So that is by way of introduction. I hope not too long, but at least I wanted to give you a sense about the kind of debates and discussions that we've been having over the last couple of months. And I welcome you to do this particular event that Professor Anwar Mal is going to present to us. As you've hopefully read, that Professor Mal has a distinguished career in the medical faculty of the University of Cape Town. He has done work on mucus for a long period of time, has managed a large project training students, apart from many other things that he has done at UCT. But as I said, he has always been interested, and he has written as a public intellectual on the relationship between religion and science, and in particular on Islam and science. So I welcome him. He is going to present to us his ideas on what is the scientific method, and also its possible, or its relationship, the way he sees it, between religion and science in general, or more particularly in Islam, that he has read about, that he has spoken and read about a lot. So welcome you, Anwar.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I hope all of you can hear me. And I just want to emphasize something that Professor Tayyab has said, that I'm looking at this purely from the point of view of a scientist. So we're going to talk about modern science challenging religion, and how does modern science impact on Islam and Muslims. Now, I'm not talking about science versus religion. I've done too many of those talks. Oh. Okay, so when you talk about science versus religion, there's a lot of articles that are actually published every day, and this debate goes on and on and on. Science versus religion, time for truth. Some people feel God is bread. America is caught in a conflict between science and religion. Can science and God get along? Those are good questions. Why isn't this thing moving? Okay, so why am I doing this talk? So I'm intrigued as a scientist that many religious people are suspicious of science and scientific activity. I just want to move this because it's covering my, okay, yeah. As science progresses, many turn to traditional sources or alternative remedies. That's something that worries me a lot. Scientific technology, in my view, has made unimaginable progress for the betterment of humanity. I don't know why it's not moving. Okay, so I'm very mindful of some of the things Professor Musa said the other day, and he said that I can't get. Professor Musa said that science is materialistic, open-ended, and godless, making it difficult to understand in the light of religious principles. Now, that's open to argument. Then he did say also that consciousness contradicts scientific materialism. And I'm not very sure that that's true either. So today I'm going to talk about modern science challenging religion. And in one sentence here, it says, in contrast, science in the modern world is godless. But I want to emphasize to you that that doesn't mean scientists are godless. So please don't conflate the two. Now, let's just talk about what the scientific method is. It's called an empirical method, that we see the world through the senses. Now, I'm going to use my personal research experience to explain to you about how we approach science and scientific ideas. What methods do we use? So you first make an observation. Now, when I was in theater with a group of surgeons once, and they wanted me to look into a stomach of a patient who had stomach cancer. I noticed something, that the mucus on the surface of the mucosa was very thin. So from that, I formulated a hypothesis. And now when you formulate a hypothesis that mucus is thin in the stomachs of people with gastric cancer, that hypothesis from the scientific methodology point of view has to be falsifiable. And then you set out a clear question with a well set out aim. So my question was, what is the role of mucus in gastric ulceration and gastric cancer? Okay, so that was my question, and it has to be very clear, and your aim has to be set out that you are going to now examine this mucus from these diseased stomachs and compare them to mucus from people with no disease. Now, the first thing a scientist asks is, has the question been explored? You got to look into scientific literature. As a scientist, you have to be very widely read. You have to discuss it with other colleagues who are in the same field as you. You have to attend seminars to go and find out what other people are thinking. And then you plan your experiment. And in your experiments, you define very well what your cohorts are going to be. In my case, it was a group of people of a similar age, right, male and female, who haven't had gastric disease, and a group who have had gastric cancer and gastric ulcer. Then you need to talk to a statistician if you're not statistically educated and ask, well, what numbers would I need to be able to, if I made a finding, to ensure that that finding was significant, I would need a certain number in both groups. And then you start your experiments. And eventually, over months or even years, you collect the data. And after you've collected the data, you do a data analysis to see if there's any statistically significant difference between the two groups, and have you answered the question. The question was very clear, but around that question is another question. If the mucus is thin on the surface of the mucosa of a patient with gastric cancer or gastric ulcer, did the cancer cause the mucus to thin out, or is the thin mucus causing the cancer? So after you've done a data analysis and come to your own conclusion, you're going to present it to colleagues. You could do it locally or internationally, and you have to actually, to put it out into the domain, outside into the international domain, you publish it in a peer-reviewed journal. And even after that, you attend conferences and you talk about your work. So you're always open to criticism from experts in your field. And a scientific fact is only so if there's evidence to support it. And there are no absolute conclusions. One conclusion leads to many other open questions. So this scientific method gives us more than one way of viewing the world. It is the investigation of phenomena, acquisition of new knowledge, correcting and integrating previous knowledge based on the gathering of data through observation and measurement. Progress through reason and rationality produces knowledge and enlightenment, always better than ignorance. And here I've chosen three of my favorite scientists: Albert Einstein, Edward Wilson of Harvard, and good old Charles Darwin, who's looking very much like a priest here. Okay, so then, if that is science and that's scientific methodology in a nutshell, you can go on talking quite a bit about it. What is religion? Is there a universal way to define it? I don't really think so, but I have chosen Karen Armstrong's definition. In the West, religion is seen as a coherent system of obligatory beliefs, institutions, and rituals centering on a supernatural God. That, for me, I put in red because, for me, any definition of religion without a higher power doesn't, for me, mean a religion, whose practice is essentially private and hermetically sealed off from all secular activities. The Arabic din signifies a whole way of life. The Talmud was expressly designed to bring the whole of human life into the ambit of the sacred. So Karen Armstrong goes on to say, the belief in and worship of a superhuman controlling power, especially a personal god or gods. That's what religion is. A particular system of faith and worship, a pursuit or interest followed with great devotion. She's a historian of comparative religion. And if you haven't read her, you have to read her. I mean, these books that I'm showing you on the screen here are amazing. And she does say that the concept of a God has evolved with time. So I want to give you, I want to sort of present this to you in a very personal way. This man here in this picture is Paul Kalaniti, Dr. Paul Kalaniti, who wrote this book, When Breath Becomes Air, and while he was writing it, he died. Paul Kalaniti, a young man who was at the threshold of an absolutely brilliant career in neurosurgery at Stanford University in the United States, was diagnosed with a lung tumor. And that changed his entire life. And he had to go for treatment, and the treatment then, which was available to him, was the usual cancer treatments: chemotherapy, radiotherapy. Surgery could have been an option, but eventually he died, very sadly. In fact, he died before completing his book, and his wife, Lucy Kalaniti, finished the book. Now, that was in about 2013, and the book was published in 2016. So that's a few years ago. And now, in 2021, I've been diagnosed with the same lung tumor, exactly the same, histologically and clinically, the same lung tumor. And I also faced the grim prospect of all kinds of very brutal treatment. But I've been a little luckier because there's a new drug available to treat me. And as you can see, alhamdulillah, I'm quite fine. I mean, I don't have any pain. I don't even think about the fact that I have a lung tumor. Now, the question, what's the question? Why is it that somebody who was so young and at the threshold of such a brilliant career had to lose his life? And here I am, a few years later, who has lived his life, most of it, and has been lucky enough to continue surviving without any brutal treatment. What do I say? Who do I thank? Do I say this is the progress of science? Or do I say thank the Almighty Lord? He knows best. Or I could say both. I could say thank God for these scientists who do marvelous things. Well, we'll talk about it. We'll come back to Kalaniti. Okay. But there's a matter of grave concern about all this. That Muslims have moved away from modern scientific thinking. And I read Nature, and if any of you know, Nature is the top journal in medicine and science. If you get something published in Nature, your career is made for life. And Nature always has these extra little bits about things that are going on in the world. A question such as this: must the Muslim world stay science poor? And this man, Ihsan Mahsood, he asked in 2006, or he said, that today's Muslim states barely register on indices of scientific research, and indications are that the situation is set to get worse. It was recently reported that the majority of PhD studies in Saudi Arabia are in theology, and that oil-rich countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Kuwait spend only 0.2% of the gross domestic product on science. And in the same journal, in the same year, another commentator said camel reproduction and falconry research is not going to set the scientific world on fire. And the same Ihsan Mahmood, 7 years later, writes again, Pakistan must seize the chance to revive its science. And it says in the middle here, in Pakistan, science minister is not seen as a proper job. Just what is going on in the Muslim world. And for me, the article that really got me thinking about writing about this topic was in National Geographic. And it talks about Professor Parvez Hoodboy, who is a world-renowned physicist teaching physics at Quad-e-Azam University in Islamabad, in Pakistan. And one day he was explaining to his students, who are all Muslim, of course, explaining to his students the mechanics of an earthquake. And while he was explaining this, they got up in protest and they left. And they said to him, this is not the explanation for earthquakes. Earthquakes are sent down by God, by Allah, to punish people who have actually moved away from the deen. And he was extremely worried. He says it isn't Islamic to teach that earthquakes are caused by the movement of tectonic plates. Instead, you are supposed to say, by the will of Allah, an earthquake happens. Hoodboy was terribly affected by that, and I think he's still very upset by it. And he wrote a book, Islam and Science, Religious Orthodoxy and the Battle for Rationality. He says science is here to stay. The future of humanity and science are inextricably tied together. Upon science depends the continuation of civilized human existence on Earth. In the past, without science, humankind was helpless before wind and storm, ravaged by plague and disease, and terrorized by mindless superstitions. Human beings created science, and science liberated them from superstition. So he says that in the quest for modernity and science, it is time to calm the waters. We must learn to drop the pursuit of narrow nationalist and religious agendas, both in the West and among Muslims. He even mentions Baghdad was once the center of the world, scientifically. And so he's written a lot of these articles, and he asks a question in this particular article: with well over 1 billion Muslims and extensive material resources, why is the Islamic world disengaged from science and the process of creating new knowledge? And he very desperately says, Islam and science have parted ways. And then his fellow countryman, Abdus Salam, probably the only Muslim in the world who's won a Nobel Prize for Physics. In 1974, Abdus Salam departed from his country, Pakistan, in protest after the Parliament of Pakistan passed unanimously a parliamentary bill declaring members of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, to which Salam belonged, non-Muslims. And he was shunned even when he won a Nobel Prize. He couldn't go back to Pakistan to celebrate it. So the situation is bad, but it's bad all over the world. I mean, Steve Jones, Professor Steve Jones, whom I've read quite extensively, of the University College London, was one day, he was interviewed by the Telegraph, here, Islam, Darwin, and the Denial of Science. And he said he was teaching a class of 50 medical students, and when he mentioned evolution, they got up and walked out. And then he's quite shocked. He said, evolution is the grammar of biology. Why train as a doctor or biologist when you deny the foundations of your subject? Would you choose English without grammar? Physics without gravity? So this divide between religion and science, including Islam and science, has many casualties. Here is Usama Hassan. Usama Hassan was the Imam of the Leighton Mosque in London. And one Friday, Juma, in the lecture, he said that he reads evolution. He said Muslims should change their attitude, their patriarchal attitudes that they practice, which harms women. And he was thrown out of the mosque. And he was thrown out of his house. His whole family was thrown out. And somebody asked me to write in his defense. And I said that it is as if Muslims do not have any problems in the world in the form of Islamophobia, invasion of Muslim lands, and the blatant killing of innocent Muslim women. The Muslim world today is less than a mere shadow of a glorious past in all aspects of life, be it the sciences, arts, politics, and literature. The situation as we know it today is dire, and whilst the harm caused by colonialism to the Muslims should not be underestimated, some Muslim countries, while being amongst the richest in natural resources, spend more on theological learning than on scientific research. There's an example of Dr. Joseph Noor, who wrote a book on evolution in the Holy Quran. He was invited by the Islamic Medical Association, and when he mentioned that evolution was in the Quran, he was asked to leave. Why? So the question we want to ask now, after those talk about those divisions, is why the universe and why and how humans originated. So the two major concepts of origins. One is that creation is by the hand of Allah, God, and the first instruction from Allah to our Holy Prophet Muhammad was Iqra bismi rabbika allazi khalaq, khalaqal insana min alaq. And I do hope, in fact, I do feel that that first instruction from God to the Prophet via the angel Gabriel said, read. And I just hope that read meant read for the rest of your life, read in every age that you live in on this planet. So Allah created, oh, I can't read this, I'm having great difficulty here. Let me see if I can move that to the bottom. This is in the Holy Quran. Allah created the heavens and the earth and all that is between them in 6 days. Okay. Now, if you read this in Arabic, وَإِذْ قَالَ رَبُّكَ لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً. Behold, thy Lord said to the angels, I will create a vicegerent on earth. And they said, will thou place therein one who will make mischief therein and shed blood? Whilst we do celebrate thy praises and glorify thy holy name, he said, this is God speaking, I know what ye know not. And he taught Adam the names of all things. Then he spoke. Now the Holy Quran describes how Allah created man from sounding clay, from the mud molded into shape. And he began the creation of man from clay and made his progeny from a quintessence of fluid. And I want to emphasize this business of fluid. Thus, human beings have a fundamental attachment to the earth. Now, in this verse here, ثُمَّ جَعَلْنَاهُ نُطْفَةٌ فِي قَرَارٍ مَكِينٍ. Nutfa, meaning sperm. And in the beginning of the second verse, the word I want to focus on is alaka, bleach. So the Quran states that of that drop of fluid, nutfa, we created a leech-like clot. Okay. Now, that alaka then evolved into a lump called mudgha. Now, the interesting thing here is there was a French researcher who wanted to describe what the developing embryo looked like when it clung to the wall of the uterus. And he couldn't find any suitable description until he read the Holy Quran. And in the Quran, it said that this developing embryo, which is attached to the wall of the uterus, looked like a leech. And this led people to, we were very excited about this. And Maurice Bucaille wrote, there is not a, in What is the Origin of Man, there is not a single verse found in the Holy Quran inconsistent to science, so it is fully scientific and purely divine scripture. Okay, and this is the book that I'm talking about here, is What is the Origin of Man. Now, this has led to people claiming that the Quran is a scientific book, but from the definition of science that I've given you, okay, you will understand that you can't make such a statement, because in the Quran, there is no scientific methodology. There might be statements about creation, but that's not science. So here's Ziauddin Sardar, puts it very well in Desperately Seeking Paradise. He says, the fundamentalists are looking for scientific miracles in the Quran. Everything from relativity, quantum mechanics, Big Bang theory, to the entire field of embryology and much of modern geology has been discovered, in inverted commas, in the Quran. So I have entered this debate in Muslim views and said, treat science and revelation as distinct entities, and I'd like to discuss this with you in the end of this talk. The other big narrative of how the universe began was through the Big Bang, 13.6 billion years ago. And ever since then, there was this inflation, and the universe continues to expand, and we have come out of the physical properties of this universe. And how did human beings originate, or how did life originate? In 1859, Charles Darwin gave us his theory of evolution and natural selection. And in that narrative, there is no God. And the relationship between modern science and Christianity hasn't been a very good one since then. We know of Galileo Galilei. He had an uneasy relationship with the church. They threatened to kill him for his views. Copernicus, who said that the earth is not the center of the universe, it's heliocentric, and Galileo Galilei took that on. And then Charles Darwin comes in 1859 and places us in the rest of the animal kingdom, kingdom Animalia, meaning that we share a common origin with the rest of living things on this planet. And Western science then separated from religion and philosophy. Okay, the church has an uneasy relationship with the ideas of Galileo Galilei. And after Darwin's On the Origin of Species, there was a complete break from the church of Darwin's origin. But I want you to just remember this, because in Islam, it was different. And then this man, Theodosius Dobzhansky, who's a famous geneticist and evolutionary biologist, actually said nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And even the Pope eventually gives his blessing to natural selection, though man's soul remains beyond science's research. And I've written quite a bit about this, you know, in the Cape Times, the Muslim News, spiritual dimension to Darwin's view of evolution, Charles Darwin. So the point Abdul Qadir Tayyab made about spirituality in science or ethics in science actually comes in here. Okay, and I was very worried, and I said in the Muslim News and the Cape Times, that over the last 150 years, there has been a resistance to Darwin's ideas from people representative of many religions, in the form of fairly common reflex responses such as Darwin's theory is anti-God, or Darwin suggests we humans arose from monkeys. Sadly, any intended discussion on the subject is immediately laid to rest. And we don't come from monkeys. I don't know where people got that idea from. So if evolution explains why a significant part of modern medicine and medical treatment is based on results from animal experimentation, because we share commonality with animals. And why xenotransplantation, the use of animals as donors for human transplantation, is being explored to compensate for a global lack of suitable human donor organs for heart and kidney transplants. Evolution has become a central concept of biology. And that's my view. And I don't think it's haram. We benefit from technological inventions based on scientific thinking, but shy away from evolutionary ideas. The responses to my pieces went what I call, and then you get in the scientific, the arbitrators or the unifiers who are trying to find the bridge between religion and science. And here's one: Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard, one of the most brilliant evolutionary biologists that ever lived. Sadly, he died recently. He formulated this theory called NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria. And he says that religion, science tells you how we came to be, religion tells us how to live. This poor man got into serious trouble with the militant fundamentalist atheists. Okay, so this man here, he's an amazing man. This man, Francis Collins, he says, he asked why I'm a man of science and faith. Francis Collins has been an advisor to Trump, Obama, and Biden. He's the head of the National Institute of Health, and he wrote this brilliant book called The Language of God, which is worth reading. And he says, I'm privileged to be somebody who tries to understand nature using the tools of science. But it is also clear that there are some really important questions that science cannot really answer, such as why is there something instead of nothing? Why are we here? In those domains, I have found that faith provides a better path to answers. I find it oddly anachronistic that in today's culture, there seems to be a widespread presumption that scientific and spiritual views are incompatible. So he has a completely different view, very much like Abdul Salam, who won the Nobel Prize in 1979, says, let me say at the outset that I am both a believer as well as a practicing Muslim. The Quran emphasizes reflection on the laws of nature. And Collins goes on to say, we must not then as Christians assume an attitude of antagonism towards the truths of reason, or the truths of philosophy, or the truths of science, or the truths of history, or the truths of criticism. As children of the light, we must be careful to keep ourselves open to every ray of light. Let us then cultivate an attitude of courage as over against the investigations of the day. And my favorite biologist, whom I think is one of the greatest living biologists on this planet, he wrote in his brilliant book, Consilience. You've got to read this. In the first line, he said, I can remember the day I discovered unified learning. He says, imagine 10,000 years ago, early farming communities and their reliance on supernatural forces for successful harvests. So you could expect those people. We'd consider them primitive today, but if the rains came and the harvest was good, they celebrated, they needed to thank somebody. If they had a drought and they lost their crop, they would look up in the sky and say, somebody's angry with us. So could Holy Writ be just the first literate attempt to explain the universe and make ourselves significant within it? We whose deepest drives of the spirit to make ourselves more than animated dust. Science is a continuation of the same effort on better tested ground to attain the same end. Science is religion liberated and writ large. And then there is this other man, he was a rabbi, Harold S. Kushner. He wrote When Bad Things Happen to Good People. He had a son who was born with progeria. It's a disease in which a 6-year-old looks like a 60-year-old. The universe was built on and governed by the laws of nature. For example, gravity, heartbeat, digestion, and random mutations. This is a very interesting man because he said he first fought with God. And he said to God, I've served you all my life, and what do? You give me a son with this condition. Then he thought deeply about it, and he said, well, we are subject to the laws of nature. And these laws are precise, reliable, and do not change. We are the miracles not because we defy these laws of nature, but precisely because we are a part of them. And another book that became a cult book, The Road Less Traveled, printed many years ago in 1982, said the path to holiness lies through questioning everything. Okay, and so there are people who, we have had casualties, we've had people who are trying to sort of form a relationship between science and religion, and then there are the sheer dividers, like Richard Dawkins of Oxford and Sam Harris, who wrote The End of Faith, and Dawkins is famous for his God delusion, and they think religion is a complete waste of time, and science is going to actually take us to an absolute understanding of the universe. But my take-home message to you, ladies and gentlemen, is that not every scientist is an atheist, not every religious person is anti-science. And the big questions: how did the universe begin? Why is there something instead of nothing? What is life and how did it come about? How does life emerge from non-life? What is mind, consciousness, meaning of life? All these are both religious and scientific questions. But each one has different way of interpreting the universe. And is a new theory born that we used to think agriculture gave rise to cities and later to writing and art and religion. Now the world's oldest temple suggests the urge to worship sparked civilization. So we are in a very exciting scientific era, the age of integration. Darwin's theory of evolution and modern genetics are now united. Physics, chemistry, and biology are consilient. Psychology and biology are conciliant. And there are people who believe that science has now reached the point where it's showing religion the way. And in it, it says that the credo of modern science rejects all received opinions. So the difference between science and religion, if there is one, is that one is a revelation and you are expected to actually, mold your soul to fit into that. And the other one is that you got to find out for yourself from bottom up. And so Descartes says, let me know only what I can know with the power of my own mind. Okay. And so experimentation, reason, evidence are the hallmarks of modern science, all built from the bottom up. And the physicists tell us that the universe is built on an uncertainty principle. Science and scientists thrive in doubt. Revelation is handed to you from top down. And I think these are the differences in the way science and religion approach the universe. But let's talk about some of the big scientific achievements of recent times. The heart transplant, which took place at our first heart transplant, took place at our very doorstep. In the same decade, oh yes, consider the heart transplant. The first patient died 18 days later. But that doesn't mean it failed, because people started thinking about rejection. Why was his heart rejected? And the whole field of immunology took off. And look where it's brought us to today. So there's no failures. The moon landings was in the same decade. This was one of the greatest achievements of the second half of the 20th century, the discovery of the structure of DNA. From there, we have found out that, take this there now, that we now know how our bodies make proteins, how our cells make protein. And from there, the entire human genome was mapped in 2000 by that man whom I spoke to about, Francis Collins. So look at how one idea builds on another. And when this happened, when DNA, your very genes, its structure was worked out, then people said, well, if your genes, something that codes for your entire body plan and then keeps you alive for 10 years at least, is something that's physical, then the dogma of protein synthesis and materialism was born. And Francis Collins, who entered this, he led the International Human Genome Project, and he says science's domain is to explore nature. God's domain is the spiritual world, a realm not possible to explore with the tools and language of science. That's his opinion. And as Ibrahim Musa said, Muslim bioethics cannot ignore the undeniable results of neuroscience. And he's actually quite right, because right here at UCT, the latest book on the neurosciences is The Hidden Spring by Professor Mark Soames. And he says, your consciousness is located here in your brainstem, which you share with the rest of the animals on this planet. Not in your fancy cerebral cortex, which is the neocortex, which human beings have the largest of. Consciousness comes from the very old brain. And then if people say that science has ignored the soul or has ignored subjectivity, one of the finders of the DNA, Francis Crick, wrote The Astonishing Hypothesis, the scientific search for the soul. And I'm telling you about these works because I would like you to read them so you could have a better understanding. And one of the biggest achievements of last year was this one by Jennifer Doudna and Michelle Carpentier, where now we can actually edit genes. So if you have a faulty gene, you know, we see so many children, it's heartbreaking to see them having single gene disorders like cystic fibrosis and things like that. And here, these two found a way of cutting out the faulty gene and inserting a normal gene. And this is going to have enormous repercussions in this 21st century. And of course, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and here's the vaccinologists. They gave us vaccines within almost a year. And we have, in the past, vaccines have wiped out a whole lot of diseases, eradicated them to make a quality of life better for all of us. Now, there's a different kind of science. This is what I call it. I don't think the physicists will like that. Martin Bucher is listening and he might not like it. But this is Newton, and he gave us the laws of motion, and he told us what gravity was about, and he even went out into the universe and told us how the planets move in their orbits around the sun. Okay, and then comes along this man, Einstein, and he says, no, I don't think Newton was right when he said that gravity is a pull. It's an attraction between two bodies that pull each other together. He says, let's forget about the notion of space and time. Let's create a new dimension called space-time. He said, you know what gravity is? Gravity is the curvature of space-time. That means that when space-time is near a big galaxy or a big star like the sun or even a planet Earth, it curves. And so you think you are being pulled, but you are walking in a curved surface. Now, he gave us these two theories, special and general relativity, right? He even told us about atoms. He told us about how energy and mass are interchangeable and on two sides of the same coin. And he actually started this business of quantum physics, which confused the world. Because with him and Newton, we got to know about the motion of planets, etc. But when they went to the atomic level or the subatomic level, the behavior of the material there was different from the big stuff, from galaxies and things like that. And he also predicted that in his general relativity, this curvature of space-time, right, at one point becomes so enormous at the point of what he called a black hole. And he said, if these black holes, where the gravity is absolutely enormous, if they had to collide, they will send out gravitational waves. Now, this is all speculation. He didn't do a single experiment. He thought about this. He did it through his mathematics. And in this 20th century, Stephen Hawking took on the study of black holes. Right? And Hawkins said that one day we will have a unified theory. We will be able to explain how the subatomic stuff and the big stuff are united. And he says, when we know that, we'll know the mind of God. And I think that got him into trouble with the Pope. But look at this. So that's 100 years ago in 1915, this man Einstein spoke about gravitational waves, and now they've been detected. And a black hole has been photographed 55 million light years away. You can't even imagine that distance. So this man says that if the world, Richard Feynman, he says if the world were to end in 5 minutes, and somebody asked me what was the greatest scientific achievement, I'll say the discovery that all matter is made of atoms. Okay, and here it is. I want to tell you, atoms are actually studied by physicists, and then they go on to molecules, cells, organs, tissues, organ systems, organisms like you and me and the cat, mind and consciousness and society. According to Steven Weinberg, all these levels, the explanatory arrow points downwards, and you can reduce everything to atoms. So physics underlies everything. Right? Now, imagine
Anwar, we have 5
the same.
Sorry.
Oh God, I'm getting worried. Okay, I'll do my best. Okay, so this is Steven Weinberg, who won the Nobel Prize with Abdus Salam. He says the more he thinks about it, the universe is meaningless. He says there's no incompatibility between science and the Quran. But what is very interesting is we were talking about things going downwards and being reduced to atoms. But if you move upwards, you find something absolutely very strange. And that is that atoms form molecules and molecules form cells. Now, molecules or macromolecules like protein, lipids, and carbohydrates are inanimate. But when they arrange in a certain way, in the form of a cell, something new emerges. Life. Life from non-life. Right? And so the whole is more than the sum of its parts. And every one of these levels can't be predicted by the previous level. But every one of these levels is actually very creative. And so this led somebody like Stuart Hoffman to say that the creative process of emergence is so stunning, so overwhelming, so worthy of awe, gratitude, and respect that is God enough for many of us. Because if you look at this, God isn't mentioned in this, but people are looking at it more closely and finding something that else could be in operation here. But the important message I want to leave with you here is that each step as you go up, there's an emergence right to the point of consciousness and mind. It becomes more and more complex as you go along. So, did science originate in the West in the 17th century? No. I mean, even people like Aristotle made mistakes. He believed in a geocentric universe. And here comes our man Copernicus, who said, no, it's not an Earth-centered universe. The sun is the center of the universe. And at that time, the universe was our solar system. And then you get somebody like Jamal Khalili, a brilliant physicist who writes about Islam and science and the relationship between Islam and modern science. And he says, my goal was to bring this story to a wider audience because it was actually believed that after the Greeks, there was a whole era until the 17th century of inactivity in the scientific era. And that was completely and utterly wrong because there was a golden age of Arabic science. And here, Dana Sobel tells us that Nasir al-Din al-Tusi and Ibn al-Shatir tweaked some of Ptolemy's ideas and set the scene for Copernicus to give us the sun its central place in the universe. So the Muslims might have had the answer, but they didn't take the great leap to say it's not an Earth-centered universe. It is a sun-centered universe. And so you can't talk about primitive science. You can't say that science began in the 17th century. You have to consider Arabic science, you have to consider Greek science, the ancient Egyptians, the pyramids, when there was no writing. In Mesopotamia, there was thought, rational thought about science. What about Homo habilis, who's almost 2 million years old? He looked for tools to make his life easier, and he carved tools out of rock. He might have been a scientific thinker. So the lesson is, we cannot say in hindsight that Copernicus was right and Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Galen were wrong. It was a contribution to knowledge during each age of time. And Mike Bruton says that the biggest secret in the world is what the Muslims have actually produced in terms of science. And we know of a lot of hadiths that the Prophet, who actually encouraged people to study or to look at the universe, and the scientific revolution of the Abbasids would not have taken place, Jim al-Khalili says, were it not for Islam. So was there a scientific method then? Well, you can't say. The Muslims recognize quantification as an instrument for studying nature and a cornerstone of science as a standalone endeavor. And that is very important. So science and religion were inextricably linked during the Golden Arabic Age. There was no conflict between religion and science. In those early years, science was inherently difficult to disentangle from theology. And I made this point to Professor Tayyab, but it needs to be discussed further. So that's unlike the West, which has separated two. Islam and science stayed together. And we've had any number of fascinating people in that Islamic history. I mean, Al-Razi, he was the greatest physician and clinician of Islam in the whole of the Middle Ages. He was the most free-thinking scholar in the whole of Islam. He was the one who gave us the idea of the control group. Remember I said, when I did my work, I had people who did not have stomach disease. That was the control group, compared to people who had stomach disease. And then there were, of course, Abu Rayhan al-Biruni and Ibn Sina. And Avicenna's canon today is still famous. It's his most famous work. And there he gives you his descriptions of medicine. So then there was evidence.
Anwar,
yeah.
Anwar, excuse me. I think you have to wrap up because there must be a lot of people who want to have questions.
Okay,
so,
okay.
If you could just give us some.
I'm going to wrap up. But I just want to mention one point where Professor Yassin Mohammed wrote this article against narrow-mindedness in Islam. And he said it is very sad because he feels that, they believe that the classical authorities and interpreters produced a body of Islamic knowledge adequate for us today. So people keep going to the old texts and actually ignore what's brought into the 21st century. Now, I won't talk about this because I want to go. So I want to make my last slide. My last slide, coming back to Kalaniti. Kalaniti himself was an atheist. And then he said, just before he was dying, he was thinking about this. And he said he believed in science and he believed in the material conditions of the universe which gave rise to him. And then he wondered, will those material conditions that created scientific enterprise, the modern scientific enterprise, will that lead me to a metaphysical position? And for him, unfortunately, shame, he came to the conclusion that it couldn't, because he said that material process of science doesn't talk to you about the self-evident subjective life that we live every day in love, in care for others, etc., etc. So he died, I think, disappointed. I didn't agree entirely with his thesis, but we can talk about it now. And thank you very much from me and my family.
Anwar, thank you very, very much. I think you took us through a very extensive tour, almost, with many slides. Thank you very much also for sharing with us your personal experiences as well. So, as we normally do, we'll invite people to It's a pity that you cannot hear everybody because everybody has to be muted. Otherwise, it just becomes quite unmanageable. So what I'm going to ask people, to raise their hands, the electronic hands, that you can do with Zoom. If you look on the screen, you'll see under reactions, you can raise your hands, and I will be able to see that immediately. All right. So, Anwar, do you want to keep your slide open there, or do you, because otherwise it might be easier to just see, just to see everybody as they are coming up.
Okay, so you want me to take my slideshow out?
Yeah, if you stop sharing, maybe.
Okay.
But you can keep. I think that's fine. That will be great. That it's fine. We can see you. We can see you now. All right.
Okay. Right.
So let me just set up some kind of basic rules so that we can have a conversation. So as soon as if you have a question, you have to just raise your hand, and then you can unmute yourself. Ask your question. Keep it brief, short. I mean, we have probably a lot of questions, and then you mute yourself again. Otherwise, we'll have interrupted sound coming from different places. Okay, so what I would like to perhaps, while I'm waiting for others to come, there are people who said they have to go, and there is one question already on the chat, but I'm going to start with my own question. It's prerogative of the chair. I mean, it's really great that you have presented this, but the one thing that I want to ask you is that you seem to be emphasizing only the good things about science. Science has also produced a lot of, I mean, we have produced, massive weapons of mass destruction. We're basically people saying that isn't science, maybe it's not a human being, but the people who have used science, have brought us to the precipice, really. In terms of whether it is pollution, whether it is, and all of these are coming directly from the development of science and technology. So how do you make a distinction between science and what it has led us to? Okay,
well,
several questions.
Yeah, you make a good point there. I agree that we created the atom bomb. I agree that politically, through racism and other terrible feelings about in between groups. You had the Tuskegee experiments in 1953 in Alabama, where they fed venereal disease to black males to see how they reacted. I think you're right. Albert Einstein was extremely worried about that. He was a pacifist, and he was terribly worried that Germany is going to make the bomb. And I think he wrote to President Roosevelt about it. So, this is a powerful thing, science. But when it's in the hands of the wrong thinking human being, it can be destructive. And that's a fact. And I'm not going to actually defend that and say everything about science is good. I know I gave a view which told us where science has brought us to and how important it is for us in the world today. I mean, each one of us, we have to look around, even this whole communication here by internet is scientific, it's through scientific technology. So it's made our lives comfortable, it's made our lives normal, it's eradicated a lot of, epidemics and pandemics. But people have made bad decisions using the power of science for purposes of destruction, and I appreciate that comment.
Okay, thanks a lot. So let me ask Professor Suleiman Dengo. I saw his name up first. Suleiman, please go ahead. You can unmute yourself and then.
Yeah. Okay, my question is, did God create human beings, or did human beings create God? And the reason I ask the question is because I've seen your entire talk, you did not mention the soul at all. And yet the Quran has so many verses about the ruh. And the fundamental beliefs, of course, is that every human being has a ruh or a soul. There was no reference at all. So my question is, and I'm looking at the chart where you talk about, progression from maybe from the cell, whatever, to the top of consciousness. So does that mean really that people created God? Or did
Right.
Allah? Yeah,
Right.
that's my
Well,
question.
that's a good question, Suleiman. Thank you for asking. Now, if you wanted me to cover everything, I would need a week, an entire week of lectures. I mean, so you're saying I didn't mention soul. I gave you two different narratives. One is a materialistic one. Okay. Now, in that materialistic one, where I took you from atoms to consciousness, there are scientists who believe that as you progress with increasing complexity, you come to a point where you have the brain, which is a physical thing. And then when you get into the realm of mind and consciousness, which is non-material, some scientists equate that with the soul. Now, one thing I must say is that there's a lot of confusion with terminology: soul, spirit, psyche, mind. Science has just kept to mind and matter and doesn't talk about soul, but some people equate the two. Okay, and then the other narrative that comes from the Holy Quran, where I spoke about creationism. It is Allah created the universe. The Quran says that very clearly. It was Allah created human beings. What I've done here is I've given you two different narratives. Now, you could merge them or you could leave them separate, like those some scientists merge them and say, as a scientist, I believe in what the Bible says, and I believe in what the scientific narrative says. And in other instances, you can say, I want to keep the two separate, and I only believe in the scientific, and I don't believe in the other one. So, it's a very complex issue. And what I've done here is try to give you both sides of the story. Now, when you ask me a question like, did man create God? There are scientists who believe that God has been bred. There are scientists who believe that, but there are other scientists who believe that no, it's God who created the universe. I'm just giving you different views.
Okay, let us move on. I'm going to ask each person to ask you a question, and we can just keep the conversation going. All right. So Leo, please, Igwe is a postdoctoral student in our group. Leo, please go ahead. Dr. Leo Igwe.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Moll, for the presentation and lecture. My question is this. I'm a little bit confused when people say Muslim scientists or Christian scientists, as the case may be. Are you saying that if a Muslim scientist, in quote, makes a discovery, we should attribute it to Islam? Can't Muslim scientists indulge in discovery of nature for the fun of it, for the love of it? So you mean every Christian, like now in the West, when a Christian discovers something like Collins, you attribute it to Christianity? I don't get it. So that's my question. Now, don't you also think, number two, don't you also think that there are contradictions sometimes? There are scientific discoveries, scientific positions that sometimes contradict what is in the Quran. Or do you think that Quran is a scientific book in the modern sense? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Two very interesting questions. You're absolutely right. I'm sorry if I came across like that. It's not Muslim science or Christian science, it's science. It has its own methodology, right? It's been there for a long time, but it was formative. And I think it's come to a point now where it's still open, but the scientific method applies. Why I was talking about Muslim science and the Christian world was that because this is a talk about science and religion and what their relationship is. Jamal Khalili, the physicist, he said that in Islam, the scientific discoveries could not have happened if it was not for the Islamic religion. So he felt that once Islam was born and once it came about, there were a lot of questions to ask. What's the time of prayer? When do we break our fast? When do we do this? He said from those questions, there were more scientific kinds of questions. So that's why he's calling it the golden age of Arabic science. But please remember that when he says Arabic science, he's not only talking about Muslims. He's not only talking about Muslims, because in that golden age, working together, where Muslims, Jewish people, even Hindus were involved as the Muslim empire expanded. So don't get me wrong there, please. And you are absolutely right. There is no Islamic science. There is no Christian science. And I've been having these conversations with the fullest students who said when they want to de-Europeanize science. And I always said to them, an atom is an atom, and it's not a Muslim atom or a Christian atom. It's an atom discovered by the scientific method. So you are absolutely right. I have no differences there. The other question, what was the second question?
There's a contradiction between religious texts and Quran and scientific discoveries.
In my view, I did show you in one of my slides. I'm sorry I had to rush through the slides at the end. There are contradictions. The contradiction is that scientists are saying that using the scientific methodology, they have to work from bottom up. If you take quantum physics, in quantum physics, things depend on predictability. There is no actually definite thing. You can't actually measure. If you know the velocity of a particle, you won't know its direction, and vice versa. That led scientists to say that the universe was built on an uncertainty principle. Whereas in the revelation, you are told, this is how it happened, and this is the absolute truth. So what scientists are saying is, we don't know the truth. We have to actually find it by methodology. Whereas religion says, we have the absolute truth. So there is a difference. But there are many people, as I went along and tried to show you, there are people who are trying to find some kind of harmonious balance, because this is a huge debate internationally, and it's dividing people. As I showed you, people were thrown out of mosques for saying they read evolution. So this is where the crux lies, the relationship between people of diverse views. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm going to ask Hassan Valley, but before I do that, let me, if I could just say a bit tongue in cheek. I mean, once you say that God has created the world, there's no certainty about it. It all depends on the will of God, which is actually quite uncertain from the perspective of a human being.
That's an interesting thought.
Let me ask Hassan Valley.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I've just got a problem here is that, first of all, Iqra is more about readers than reciters. By my definition of readers is that searching and looking for knowledge all the time. That's more important. So a man's life from birth to death is about seeking knowledge. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says he has created inna khalqi samawati wal ard. That means between the heavens and the earth, it is in our realm that we have to know it. Otherwise we can't worship Allah. So there is no limitation there. But my judiciary is that Allah has given us three paradigms, or what can I use a better word?
Can you ask a question, please?
Yeah, the question is that the issue of revelation, after man's freedom of his sense perception and his intellect, then there comes revelation. So we have this concept of seeking knowledge, but it's got to be within revelation. In other words, when you come to the end of your science, whatever it is, the absolute truth belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right. Two, ethics. Ethics and morality govern science. So the question about creating weapons of mass destruction, everything else falls within ethics. Trying to create life will fall within ethics. So I'm trying to find a balance there, that Islam has not really restricted us in science, but it reflects us at where we arrived at. I think that's important. Can you help me on that one?
Thank you.
Yeah, I look, I mean, he's expressing an opinion, and I actually am, I'm being very honest here. I don't know how to help him, because if you say it has to come, the view of a world has to come through revelation. You know, scientific facts are not revealed in that way. Scientific facts are discovered through a methodology. That's a big difference. I'm sorry, but I can't help him there. It's not within my sort of intellectual ambit to go there, because I don't have the knowledge to share in that regard.
Okay, thank you very much. Abdi Shafat, please go ahead. Abdi Fatah, are you still there?
Sorry, I was talking. I forgot to unmute myself.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Tayob and Professor Moll, for such an exhilarating presentation. Thank you very much. I got two questions. Number one is, listening to your talk, I kind of felt, I took away the feeling that somehow science is reaching for religion and trying to take it down all the time. But religion is this like lumbering elephant that keeps moving. If that is the case and has been the case for a long time, what is the need for any more comparative analysis between the two things? I mean, between the two concepts, religion and science. That's number one. Number two, you also give some interesting statistics from the Middle East as well as Pakistan, where you gave, you said that most students were studying theology in the Middle East, while somebody who had won the Nobel was chased away from Pakistan because of his sect. So my question in that regard is, can you help us draw some conclusion on the attitude that we should draw from this? So the attitude, is it from religion, Islam in this case, or the people, or status quo, or the ruling elite? What should we draw from this? Is there something within the society or the history or, whatever, the government in place that is anti-science? Can you help us navigate through this?
Yeah, I know it's a difficult one. I personally don't feel that you could judge somebody by what they do and say, well, you don't belong to us, and therefore you must leave. So because you're an Ahmadiyya and your views are not exactly like mine, you should leave. Whether they did that to him only because he was Ahmadiyya or because he was so scientifically involved, I don't know. But I think those decisions are really political decisions. I don't think they got anything to do. I don't think there's any religious view which tries to divide people along those lines, frankly. So I was very, very disappointed reading about his life. And after he won the Nobel Prize, Abdul Salam, he tried to go back to Pakistan, and apparently he was not welcome there because that was his home country. So he did his best work in a European country, and he celebrated his success there. These decisions are made by governments. These decisions are made by people who are in power. Even if they're wrong, they are able to actually make these decisions and categorize human beings in that way. And that is an absolute pity. What was your first question? Is he gone? What was the first question, Amkar?
The first question was, yeah, sorry, he's there.
Oh, okay. So basically, the first question was, I was wondering if you get the impression that science has ego problems. Sorry, science has ego problems where it's trying to take down this religion, but it's still stoically standing there.
Look, there's science there's science, which is a philosophy, and it's a methodology, and there are scientists. Now, I've worked at a laboratory bench all my life. I've traveled the world and I've met scientists from diverse backgrounds. You know, people are human. Some of them are extremely arrogant about their scientific knowledge, and they'll cast off any other view with a wave of a hand, right? And there are others who want to know what you as a religious person think, what you as a person who comes from this particular background think. So it's not a homogeneous thing. Your point about you get the impression that science and scientists are actually going for religion to push it out of the way. Yes, I've shown you people who do that. Richard Dawkins does that. Sam Harris does that. Christopher Hitchens does that. He says religion poisons everything. And science is the only way to go. Science is the only narrative that is going to take us to enlightenment. There are those, but there are others, like I showed you. Brilliant scientists, Edward Wilson, Stephen Jay Gould, who tried to actually harmonize a relationship, to try to stop this division. So you know, the world's a strange place, and whatever you're looking for, you will find. Yeah, it's unfortunate, but I personally don't think that through my talk I wanted to give you the impression that scientists are out to destroy the idea of religion completely. I don't get that impression. I don't have that impression.
Okay. We'll come to Allah, but just before I do that, let me take one question from the side, from the chat. Okay. If I could just ask you just to keep your responses brief. I'm sorry for asking you that, but we are coming to the end. So the one question is that, you know, the first question that is coming from the chat is that you seem to be saying that religion is against science or Islam is against science. He's asking if there is any particular religious text that says that one should not, one should not engage in science. Why are you making this leap from what Muslims do and then attributing that to religion?
No, the answer is no. I'm not doing that. As I told you that I gave you different viewpoints. Right? Okay. The next question.
Yeah. So next question is, agree that Muslims contributed much in the history of science. This is from Professor Asonzes Uka from our head of department. What stopped Muslim scientists from continuing in that tradition where faith and science are in conversation and mutual understanding contemporary society? So if the Muslims had, you know, contributed to science earlier, what stopped them from doing now? What are the kind of inhibiting factors at the moment in modern society?
Professor, that's a very common question, and a lot of people are looking into it. Some people say Islam didn't have an enlightenment, right? Some disagree with that. Some people say it was the Crusades. Karen Armstrong feels that the real point where things actually changed was in 1492 during the Inquisition, because if you read about the Inquisition, it's mainly focused on what happened to the Jews, but the same thing happened to the Muslims in Spain. So there's many things, but you know, in common discussion with fellow Muslims that I have encountered over the years, there's a viewpoint that we were misled mainly by people who took the position of being ulama and who actually brought in their personal opinions and influenced thinking like the kind of thinking we see today, where amongst a certain part of the population there's an anti-science feeling. So there's so much speculation about this question. And I think it's going to be a question that stays in our consciousness for years and years and years. And it's a question that we'll be trying to answer. And I don't know if we'll come to a suitable agreement about it.
Okay, let me give Allah a chance to ask this question.
Thank you, Prof, and thank you for this presentation. I wonder if we want to take as our point of departure to address this question the Enlightenment regime of truth and the invention of what become known as the scientific truth and the objective truth. And it is at this moment when this division happen, when this division, differentiation, and declassification between religion and science, it happened at the moment of Descartes, I think, and then Kant, and then to Max Weber, and then to the current situation. So I wonder if we want to look at the political of it and the colonialism. Maybe what will answer me why Muslim countries do not engage in science. One, it could be colonialism, and second, modern copyright. Also now the global West did not allow people to produce vaccine because they're concerned about the copyright. So how this notion of ownership and copyright had restrict Muslim society, not Muslim individual, by the way, because if you remember, those who first find out the vaccine for corona were two Muslims from Turkish living in Germany. So maybe instead of why not Muslim, maybe we could ask about Muslim society in the global South, in Africa and elsewhere. And with this in mind, maybe we also need to bring colonialism as a factor on the table that might help us understand why we're not engaging in science. Thank you.
No, I can't disagree with you. You've chosen colonialism, and there were other examples I gave you, like the Crusades and the Inquisition, and the role of the ulama. I can't disagree with you, and I think the imbalance of forces and the inequality between the wealthy North and the poorer South has been a great factor. And then you have to consider Middle Eastern states, which have so much money, so many resources like oil. They're not engaging in science. So as Pervez Hoodboy says, that it's a mindset that has actually entrenched itself over generations. And that mindset has to be broken. That's the impression he had when he taught physics at Quad Nizam University. So you make a very important point. I mean, I fully agree that the ravages of colonialism have to be brought into, have to be factored into our debate. Sure.
So do you have one question still on this on the chat? I'm going to read it. Do you have any thoughts about the next stage in the development of scientific and religious discourses once we go deeper into the post-human era, where artificial intelligence and biotechnologies will force us to recalibrate our self-understanding and agency in the universe? This is the focus of my current research with a link to Islamic religious education. By the way, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Technology and Applied Sciences in Oman. So the question is about the future of science. Will it take a slightly different direction from the one that you have suggested when we think about the post-human era, when you talk about robotics, and are robots going to be perhaps better scientists than human beings?
Well, I'm a bit worried, because even in the world of fictional literature, they're telling us that the robots are going to be cleverer than us. In fact, I just read a review of a book by James Lovelock, who thinks that the human civilization, I read it in the London Review of Books, that the human civilization is coming to an end. It's got nothing to do, he said, with climate change. Climate change or no climate change, we've reached the pinnacle. Humanity has reached the pinnacle of its development, and it's headed for destruction. And it's going to be taken over by androids. It's going to be taken over by, the world's going to be taken over by artificial intelligence. Now, to me, that view doesn't gel. I don't agree with it. But it's something that people are thinking about. What is the future of humanity? And in that sense, what is the future of religion? What is the future of science? Now, I think thinking about what Allah said, that scientific trajectory, although it's sort of going up and up and up, and it's giving us better technology, I'm very worried. I'm very worried that, as Allah says, you got to consider the politics of this. Now, if you look at it even just today, The Western world has given us the COVID vaccine, but the African countries can't source it. So what is happening about the distribution of scientific benefits in the world? It's being hoarded by the rich and rich countries. So I think we should be focusing now more on that and realize that politics have to be factored in. It's not as if science works on its own and produces all these marvelous, marvelous inventions. And then you come to a point where, oh, you're living in this brave new world and it's absolutely fascinating. There is the politics and there is inequality. It's not only inequality between the northern and southern hemispheres, and the southern hemisphere has been terribly exploited through colonialism and imperialism. But it's within countries themselves where you see great divides, and you can see the xenophobia in Europe. They just don't want foreigners there, and yet they colonized the third world and they enjoyed extracting its resources. So the question you raise is a very complex one. And I think that's very exciting in a sense, because we're going to look at this from a very, very broad perspective, and not like how I approach it today. My brief was just to give you a viewpoint, the viewpoint of scientists in relation to religion. But as Abdul Qadir Tayyib said, it's far more complex than that, and there's other things we have to factor in to understand this complexity.
Thank you very, very much. I think you've given us a really good, I really like, the first of all, sharing with us your, scientific project and your methodology, and then also sharing with us, the people who have been thinking about, the relationship between religion and science. What I think is what your lecture has opened up perhaps for more reflection and thinking is what some people have called the culture of science, or maybe the sociology of science. And this is where we in the social sciences have to, can perhaps contribute to thinking about, when after you're getting out of a lab, for example, or when you're doing the science, what are the kinds of, what kind of political support comes in the support of funding, for example, like you mentioned, Saudi Arabia, other countries who are wealthy, who don't really spend a lot of, who don't really spend enough on promoting science, for example. I mean, notwithstanding the kind of cultural or religious questions there might be. But I think the sociology or maybe the culture of science will sort of perhaps look at it. And it seems to me that it should be done in an interdisciplinary way, not entirely done only by social scientists, but with scientists as well. So Anwar, thank you very much for sharing these ideas and also sharing some insights, that you have been thinking about. We really appreciate that. There are some continuing discussions going on the side. I'm not going to read that, but I think that we've come to about 1.5 hours. I think we've put you in the spotlight long enough. So thank you very, very much for sharing.
I don't mind.
And thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I know that.
Thanks.
So
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. And thank you for the rest of you also, for those of you who have stayed, and also for those who have left, obviously, as well. Thank you for sharing and asking questions. I hope that I have addressed all of them. There are some recommendations on the side that you could look at as well. So when we share this with you, you'll be able to see the questions as well. Okay, it would have been a good idea to have a cup of tea or something to drink, but in time of Zoom, we just have to say goodbye and hope to see you, in 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, we have, let me plug in a little bit of an advertisement. So we're having our next presentation by Professor Mariam Al-Attar. I saw her, I don't know if she's still here, but I saw her in the audiences a while ago. I think she's left. She is going to be speaking to us. She has done some work on the ethics of Islam, and she's going to be speaking about moral foundations in Islam. I think that it promises to be a very interesting paper and a presentation. I've read her book. I also recommend you to read a book on the ethics of Islam. She is also currently working on intellectual property, something that you just mentioned, or at least Allah mentioned, which I think that we heard her at our conference earlier. So have a good evening, good weekend. If your weekend is starting tomorrow, and hope to see you in 2 weeks' time. If you have registered for this seminar, you will get a notification from us, in a few days' time.